In a world that too often speaks over silence, one man reminded a town, and all of us, what real strength looks like. His name was Calvin Rohr. He didn't wear medals on his chest, didn't ask for thanks, and never raised his voice. Instead, he served pancakes at sunrise, held doors for strangers, and quietly carried the weight of battles no one ever saw. Most walked past him without a second glance, until one morning a pointed finger tried to erase him, and a town remembered what respect truly means. This isn't just a story about a veteran. It's about a quiet legacy, built one cup of coffee and one act of kindness at a time. Let this story open your heart and your eyes. The woman's voice sliced through the cozy hum of the cafe. "This place is for decent folks, not people like that," she snapped, her tone as sharp as her perfectly manicured nail, which now pointed with unmistakable disgust across the room. Every head turned. In the far corner booth, an older man sat alone. His jacket, once military green, was now faded and threadbare. Steam rose gently from his untouched cup of coffee, curling into the golden light streaming through the window. He didn't look up. He didn't even flinch. His hand stayed wrapped around that mug as if he were holding on to something much heavier than coffee, something invisible, yet immense. A hush fell over the diner. Forks paused mid-bite. A mother quietly hushed her toddler. A teenage waitress stopped mid-pour, frozen, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Her eyes darted toward the corner booth. No one, especially not the woman now seething at the center of attention, knew that the man she was publicly shaming was the very person who had once built this diner with his own two hands. And in just a few minutes, a single step through that glass door would bring everything to a halt. Forks would hover in midair, eyes would widen, and every person in that room would be reminded what the word respect truly meant. The Milstone Café had a kind of charm that couldn't be bought or faked. Wood-paneled walls soaked in stories, worn leather booths with years of conversations embedded in their seams, and the comforting clatter of cutlery meeting hot plates. On any given Saturday morning in Brookfield, Missouri, it was alive with the sounds of a small town in motion. Churchgoers stopping by before the sermon, farmers fresh from the market, old friends swapping gossip over black coffee. And the scent, oh, the scent, bacon crisping on the griddle, buttery biscuits warming hearts before they reached mouths. It smelled like memory. Grace weaved through the tables like she'd been born doing it, 3 mugs in one hand, her ponytail bouncing with every quick step. 17, sharp as a whip, saving tips for college and able to remember your coffee order after 2 visits. She dodged a small child chasing his reflection near the jukebox and smiled automatically, but her eyes were alert. Something about today felt different. There was a tension in the air, soft, electric, like the moment before a summer storm when everything stands still and the sky forgets to breathe. Then the door opened. The sound of heels on tile echoed, sharp and rhythmic. Marjorie Layton had arrived. Tall, in her 70s, and every bit as commanding as she was decades ago, Marjorie moved like royalty walking into court. Her navy blazer was pressed to perfection, pearl earrings glinting beneath the warm diner lights. She clutched her designer purse tightly against her ribs, as if the walls themselves might rise and try to steal it. Her eyes swept across the room, cold and calculating. Then she saw him, Calvin Rohr, same booth, same jacket, same stillness. To most, he looked like a quiet old man lost in his routine, maybe a little unkempt, a little forgotten by time. But to Marjorie, he was something entirely different. She strode forward and said it, loud enough to make the door chime again as it settled behind her. "Excuse me," she barked. Every eye turned again. Grace froze, mugs trembling slightly in her grasp. Marjorie pointed. "This place is for decent folks, not people like that." The cafe went quiet, truly quiet. Even the child stopped fussing. A man in overalls lowered his fork, watching. Grace swallowed hard. She looked at Calvin. Still, he didn't move. He just sat there, hands around his cup, like he couldn't bear to let go, like it was the only thing anchoring him in the moment. "Filthy jacket," Marjorie went on, voice dripping with disdain. "Looks like he hasn't had a proper bath in a week, and you let him sit by the window. It's disgusting." Grace's eyes flicked toward the kitchen. Where was the manager? No sign of him. She turned back to Marjorie, her voice soft but firm. Ma'am, he's a regular here. I don't care if he built the place with his bare hands, Marjorie snapped, cutting her off. It's upsetting. It ruins the whole atmosphere. Grace's mouth opened, searching for the right words, then closed again. Behind her, no one spoke. That's when Calvin moved. Not much, just enough to reach into his jacket pocket and pull out a $5 bill. He placed it gently beside his cup. No protest, no defense, not even a glance back. He stood slowly like every step cost him something. Now it was clear. He was favoring one leg, his limp noticeable as he made his way toward the door. Still silent, still dignified, head high, shoulders straight. Grace instinctively stepped aside, heart pounding in her chest. The bell jingled softly as the door opened and closed behind him. Marjorie huffed, turned on her heel, and walked toward the counter as if she hadn't just ripped something sacred out of the room. But something had shifted. Something deep. In the quiet that followed, no one knew exactly what to say. There was shame in the air, embarrassment, but also something else, something wordless, like a reckoning was on its way. No one had the faintest idea that the man they just dismissed and ridiculed was, in fact, the very owner of the diner they were sitting in. But in just a few minutes, that truth would drop like a hammer, shaking the air and every soul within those walls. Calvin Rohr never liked talking about the war, not because he lacked stories to tell, but because the ones that mattered were carved so deep they were nearly impossible to speak aloud. He was only 19 when he landed in Dang, Vietnam. 19. Not even old enough to legally drink, barely old enough to vote, but already burdened with the lives of others in his hands. He was a Marine recon scout, trained for silence, bred for survival. He spent most of his tours crawling through the jungle, reading the land like a second language. His job was to gather intelligence, mark routes, and navigate terrain so hostile even the trees seemed to breathe malice. It was dirty, quiet work, the kind that didn't end up in movies or headlines. And it was during the thickest weeks of monsoon season that he was sent on the mission that would cost him nearly everything. 2 Navy medics had been pinned down after their helicopter went down somewhere near the Laotian border. The storm had killed radio signals, and the information they had was stale, days old. Still, command sent them in. Orders were orders, and Calvin was the kind of Marine who never left a job undone. They moved under the cover of night, rain hammering down in sheets so dense it swallowed the sounds of their own boots. It was a darkness that felt alive, and Calvin didn't navigate by sight. He navigated by instinct. Somehow, against all odds, he found the clearing. The medics were there, still breathing, huddled beneath the warped skeleton of the chopper. Enemy forces were closing in. There were 7 men on Calvin's team. Only 6 would make it back. Calvin was the last one out of the tree line when the mortar landed. He remembered the sound, not the explosion itself, but what came before. A crack like the sky snapping in half, then unbearable heat, and then nothing. He woke up a week later in a military hospital in Japan. Shrapnel embedded in his spine, partial hearing loss in one ear, a right leg that would never move the same again. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. He didn't feel lucky. He felt unfinished. When he returned home, there were no parades, no banners, no welcome home crowds. There was only silence and suspicion. People crossed streets to avoid the man with the limp. Job applications disappeared without reason. Store clerks whispered when they saw the telltale military haircut in the haunted eyes. Vietnam veterans didn't return as heroes. They came back as shadows. So Calvin disappeared. He packed what was left of his life and moved west, to Missouri, to a nameless town where no one knew who he'd been. With a modest VA pension and a bottom-rung loan, he bought a broken-down diner and made it his own. He never told a soul about his past, never hung up medals, never mentioned the war. He worked long, punishing hours, 16-hour days slinging hash, scrubbing floors, fixing ancient plumbing with duct tape and silent prayers. He didn't complain. He didn't brag. He didn't need to. But he never stopped serving. If a man walked in shivering with empty pockets, Calvin made sure a plate of eggs and toast found its way to his booth without a word. If a single mother ordered one plate for her 3 children to split, Calvin doubled the portion and smiled like it was policy. If a young, nervous veteran sat at the counter, hands twitching and heart racing, Calvin poured his coffee extra hot and kept the conversation to a nod. He donated to the local VFW without ever showing up to a meeting, paid neighbors' heating bills through quiet contributions to the town charity, patched roofs after storms, left groceries on porches, and never knocked. People believed the Milstone Café survived because of the food, but it thrived because Calvin fed more than hunger. He fed dignity. And still, no one knew. No plaques, no news stories, no signs above the door. Just a man with a limp in a weathered military jacket serving pancakes like it was his duty. Until that morning, until someone pointed at him with scorn, tried to reduce him to nothing, and something in the air shifted. Something in the town stirred. The front door to the Milstone Café creaked open again, the sound dragging heavier than usual, as though the wind itself braced for what came next. The cheerful jingle of the bell didn't ring this time. Instead, silence wrapped around the space. A man stepped through, tall. Civilian clothes, yes, but his posture gave him away. Rigid shoulders, purposeful stride, and eyes that scanned the room with sharp precision. He didn't need to wear a uniform. Everything about him said, soldier. Every psyche of his stance spoke volumes, the kind of presence that turned heads even without a word. Colonel David Clean had arrived. To anyone passing by, he looked like nothing more than another older gentleman in a clean press coat. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with quiet dignity. But there was something else, something you couldn't quite put into words. The moment he stepped into the diner, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and forks hovered halfway to mouths, as if the very air had thickened. Grace, standing by the soda fountain, felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. She didn't know why, but something about the man stirred something deep inside her. David Clean's eyes slowly scanned the room until they landed on a booth tucked into the far corner, the one Calvin had just left. A half-full mug still sat there, steam curling up faintly like a memory that hadn't quite disappeared. "Excuse me," Clean said, his voice calm but with a commanding undercurrent. He approached the counter with quiet intensity. "I'm looking for a man named Calvin Rohr. Just saw him walk out." Marjorie, seated near the counter and halfway through her coffee, glanced up, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. She gave a smug little sniff and said, "If you mean that homeless man who was sitting over there earlier, he left. Good riddance." Grace opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, unsure of what to say. Clean's jaw flexed subtly, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned sharply and headed straight for the front door, his strides long and deliberate. Outside, Calvin was standing beside his old Chevy pickup, fumbling with his keys. In the morning light, his limp was more pronounced. He hadn't noticed the black SUV parked just a few spaces away, nor had he seen the man approaching with determined steps. But he recognized the rhythm of those footsteps. Slowly he turned, his eyes widened. "Colonel?" "Just David now," Clean said, extending a hand. Calvin stared at the hand for a moment, then reached out to shake it. His grip was firm, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the diner's windows. He knew they were watching. Faces, curious and confused, were already pressed against the glass. "Sir, if this is about some ceremony or press thing," Calvin started, but Clean cut him off gently. "It's not about that. This is personal." His voice was lower now, steady as a promise. "I've been looking for you, Calvin. I came to thank you. Properly." Calvin shifted his weight uncomfortably, looking down. "You don't have to, sir." "I do," Clean replied without hesitation. "You saved my life. You saved the lives of my men. I got to walk my daughter down the aisle. I got to watch my grandson pitch in his first baseball game. None of that happens if you hadn't seen what we all missed that night in Cambodia." Calvin turned his face away, unable to hold the gaze. Clean paused, glancing back at the diner. "You trying to disappear?" he asked, his voice quiet again. "Trying not to make waves," Calvin muttered. A small smile touched Clean's lips. "I think a wave's already been made." And with that, he turned and headed back toward the diner. Calvin hesitated, eyes drifting toward the highway, toward the idea of freedom, of escape. He could leave. He could vanish again. But something rooted his feet to the pavement. Slowly, silently, he followed. When they stepped back inside, the diner was dead quiet. Every head turned, silverware sat idle. Even the fry cook had stopped mid-scramble, spatula frozen in midair. Marjorie blinked in confusion. "What's he doing back in here?" David Clean raised his hand for silence. Then he stepped forward and placed a hand on Calvin's shoulder. "I'd like to say something," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. He looked at Calvin. "This man," he began, pausing just long enough for every eye to fix on Calvin, "is Calvin Rohr. He owns this cafe, and he's one of the finest Marines I ever had the privilege to serve alongside." A hushed awe filled the room. No one spoke. No one dared to. Clean went on. "He didn't ask me to come here. In fact, he didn't want me to. But I came anyway, because people deserve to know who they're sitting next to, who's pouring their coffee every morning, who keeps showing up, not for applause, but because that's just the kind of man he is." Grace's eyes welled with tears. In the back corner, the young man who had earlier mocked Calvin lowered his head in shame. A trucker set his mug down slowly, almost reverently. Marjorie opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Clean's gaze swept across the room once more. "This man saved lives, and he never asked for recognition. He just built this place and showed up, day after day. You may not have known who he was before, but now you do." He stepped back, letting the silence settle. And for the first time in years, Calvin Rohr lifted his head and truly saw the people around him, saw that he was no longer invisible. Marjorie Leshin sat stiffly in her seat, her spine ramrod straight. But it wasn't pride that froze her. It was realization. She had spent decades perfecting every detail of her appearance, always composed, always elegant, always in control. But now, surrounded by the hush of onlookers and the weight of her own misjudgment, it all felt hollow. The pearls around her neck, the crisp blazer, the carefully practiced poise, it all hung on her like paper armor, flimsy and false. The man she had casually dismissed, the one she had spoken down to like he didn't matter, wasn't just someone. He was Calvin Rohr, a Marine, a survivor, the owner of the very diner she had insulted him in. And the part that cut deepest, he hadn't even flinched. He let her say those things, not because he agreed, not out of weakness, but because he didn't need to defend himself. That kind of strength, quiet, unshakable, unmoved, shamed her more deeply than any scolding or reprimand ever could. Calvin still stood near the counter, unmoving, as though unsure what was expected of him now. The room's attention clung to him, but his eyes stayed downcast, resting somewhere near the floor tiles. Then slowly, Marjorie stood up from her booth. Each step she took toward him was an ordeal. Her heels struck the tile with sharp clicks that echoed loudly in the still air. And when she spoke, her voice wasn't polished like it always was. It was thin, uncertain, quivering. "Mr. Rohr," she began, then hesitated. "Calvin," he answered softly, lifting his gaze. She had never seen eyes like his. They were quiet, calm, but weighted, like they carried things too heavy to name. It wasn't something you could see at a glance, but once you noticed it, it stayed with you. That kind of depth only came from sacrifice, from pain born in silence over time. "I owe you," she said, the words scraping their way past her pride. "I owe you a very deep apology." Calvin didn't respond. He just stood there, listening. "I didn't know who you were," she continued, her voice trembling now. "But that doesn't excuse anything. It might explain how I reacted, but not justify it." She swallowed hard. For the first time that morning, her hands started to shake. "My husband, Richard," she said, "he served in the Navy. He was in Vietnam, too. When he came back, he was different. He had nightmares that no one could understand. He'd scream in his sleep, wake up drenched in sweat. He couldn't hold a job. People looked at him like he was broken." Over by the soda fountain, Grace stood frozen with a coffee pot in her hand, forgotten, untouched, watching. "I spent years trying to help him fit in," Marjorie continued. "I used to polish his shoes before he left the house, made him wear long sleeves to hide the burns. I didn't want people to judge him." Her voice cracked. "And yet, Here I am doing exactly what they did to him. The cafe was still. Not a fork clinked, not a whisper stirred. I became the very thing that hurt the man I loved, she whispered, shame folding her voice into a hush. She looked down, then slowly raised her eyes to Calvin's once more. When I saw you sitting there this morning, I didn't see you, I saw my own fear, my shame, my weakness. Tears gathered in her eyes, but this time she didn't hide them. I can't undo what I said, she admitted, but I can say I'm sorry. Truly. There was a long pause. Then at last, Calvin gave a small nod. No speech, no lecture, just a simple, quiet gesture that said, I hear you. We all have bad days, he said, voice deep and rough from years of silence. I hope tomorrow's better for you. And that was it. He didn't chastise her, didn't recite his achievements, didn't ask for anything in return. Grace blinked. She had expected something else. Fireworks, an explosion, a dramatic confrontation. But this was different, stronger. Marjorie stood there for a moment longer, maybe waiting for something more. But then something in her face shifted, the realization that she didn't deserve more. She reached into her purse, took out a crisp $50 bill, and walked back to the booth Calvin had left. She placed the money gently beside the untouched cup of coffee. Then, without another word, she left. No grand exit, no final remarks, just silence. A few seconds later, the clinking of silverware began again, softly at first, then gradually returning to life. But something in the air had changed, not just in the room, but in the people. Grace finally set the coffee pot down and wiped her sleeve across her eyes. She wasn't crying, not exactly, but something in her chest felt full in a way she couldn't explain. She looked over at Calvin, still standing in his worn jacket, an unassuming man with a permanent limp and hands that had carried more weight than most could bear. He caught her eye and gave her the same nod he'd given Marjorie. Not a thank you, not a request, just recognition. And in that moment, Grace understood something she never had before. Respect wasn't loud, it didn't shout, it didn't need to be seen. Sometimes it just stood quietly and stayed. It all began with a whisper. A few regulars at Milstone Café casually mentioned what had happened that Saturday morning to their neighbors. Then someone's niece shared it on social media. Grace, still visibly moved and stirred in ways she couldn't explain, pinned a short message on her school's community board titled, The Man in Booth 3. By Monday, local radio picked up the story. By Friday, it had made the county newspaper. But none of it came from a press release. Calvin Rohr never breathed a word. He just returned the next day, same as always, 20 minutes before sunrise, apron tied, prepping the pancake batter, testing the coffee maker like any other morning. As if nothing had happened, except something had changed. When Calvin unlocked the cafe door, someone was already waiting. A veteran in a wheelchair. His name was Mike. The following morning, two older men in worn Vietnam vet caps took the booth by the window. They didn't speak much, they just nodded when Calvin limped by. And then came the Thursdays. There were no announcements, no flyers, no planning. But somehow, the cafe began to fill, quietly, steadily, with more veterans each Thursday morning, always before the breakfast rush. They came without fanfare, without uniform or decoration. No one gave speeches. They didn't come to be seen. They came for black coffee, scrambled eggs, and something much harder to describe: presence. They sat in what people began to call Ty's Corner, a simple space near the back wall, once overlooked, now sacred. Calvin never sat with them. He said it was their table, their space. But he was always there, refilling mugs, adding another plate of toast, making sure the coffee stayed hot. And somehow, in that corner, it always did. Grace, watching from behind the counter, felt something unfolding. Something reverent, something solemn, something real. She began to bring in a notebook. Quietly, carefully, she started recording names, military branches, years of service, and places they had been stationed. Some were hesitant. But when Calvin gave a small nod, they opened up. What started as a simple list became something more. With the support of her history teacher, Grace launched a small oral history project called Voices of Service. She began interviewing veterans from Brookfield and nearby towns. Many had never told their stories. Some gave her only a paragraph. Others took hours. Some May stories left her teary-eyed. Others had her laughing out loud. But every single one carried the same undertone: sacrifice, dignity, in the quiet strength of silence. The back corner of the diner transformed. What was once an unused stretch of wall near the restrooms became a tribute. Grace adorned it with photos, some donated, some pulled from old albums, some printed from Calvin's own private stash, one he swore didn't exist. Above it all, she mounted a simple wooden sign her father had carved by hand: "Respect is served here." It didn't take long for customers to begin contributing their own tributes. One woman brought in a black and white photo of her grandfather in his WF2 uniform. A young boy in a Cub Scout shirt asked if he could hang his great-uncle's dog tags on the wall. Calvin didn't say much, just nodded. His eyes misted over. Even Marjorie came back. No big announcement, no apology. Just one quiet afternoon, she walked in with her grandson, tall, lanky, in a blue hoodie. "This is Eli," she said to Calvin. "His dad's serving overseas. Marines. I thought maybe—" But she didn't finish. Calvin sat down with Eli for 20 minutes. He didn't talk about firefights or trauma. He didn't dramatize war. Instead, he spoke about duty, about showing up, about the meaning of coming home, about community, about belonging, about the weight and beauty of service. When they finally got up to leave, Eli took Calvin's hand in both of his and held it with quiet strength. A week later, something shifted again. Thursdays became free for veterans, not because Calvin announced it, not because there was a special deal. The register simply stopped ringing them up. Grace took care of it wordlessly. And for a while, Calvin paid the difference out of his own pocket, until a few regulars noticed and began slipping extra bills beneath their plates. No questions asked. The cafe had changed. Not the booths, not the menu, not the sticky laminated special sheet by the register. Farmers still ordered the big Thai breakfast. Truckers still asked for extra bacon. Kids still argued over who got the last grape jelly packet. But something unspoken had taken root. There was a different kind of hush, a new kind of care in the air. People pulled out chairs for strangers. They stepped aside in line. They noticed when someone lingered a little longer by the tribute wall and gave them space. Without rules, without being told, just respect. And still, Calvin never liked— he always flinched whenever someone used the word hero. It made him uncomfortable, as if it didn't belong to him, as if it were meant for someone else. But to Grace and to so many others in Brookfield, he reshaped the meaning entirely. He taught her that true leadership didn't come with medals, stars, or grand speeches. It came in the form of quiet, consistent acts, done without expectation of recognition. He showed her that a man could serve his country, save lives under fire, then come home and spend the rest of his life pouring coffee and offering peace, and still be the strongest presence in any room. Years later, when Grace was invited to speak at a county ceremony honoring local veterans, she stood behind the podium, cleared her throat, and began with words that had lived in her heart for a long time. "I didn't learn about war from history books," she said. "I learned about it from a man who folded napkins before the sun came up and limped across the linoleum floor of a diner for people who never even knew his name. His name was Calvin Rohr. He never asked us to remember him, but we always will." And just like that morning so long ago, the entire room fell still. Not because anyone told them to be silent, but because they felt the weight of that moment. Because some legacies aren't carved into stone or taught in schools. Some are quietly stitched into the booths of old diners, whispered through acts of kindness, and carried in the unspoken strength of a man who simply showed up and made the world around him a little softer, a little stronger. Outside, the sun continued to rise over Brookfield, casting its warm light over the narrow two-lane highway, brushing gold across the roof of the Milstone Café. Dew clung stubbornly to the windows like it always had. The rest of the world was rushing, cars honking, phones buzzing, clocks ticking faster than ever. But inside the Millstone, time had its own rhythm. Slower, steadier, more intentional. Calvin's mornings hadn't changed. He still arrived before dawn, the keys cold in his hand, his limp persistent but steady. His routine wasn't just a habit, it was part of who he was. Unlock the door, flip on the lights, check the grill, brew the first pot of coffee, wipe down the corner booth, even if nobody had sat there the day before. That booth meant something. It always had. Only now, Calvin wasn't invisible anymore. The quiet he carried didn't blend into the background like it once had. That silence had become something different, something sacred, revered. It was no longer mistaken for insignificance. It had become a kind of quiet leadership, one that didn't demand attention but commanded respect. People looked at him differently now, though he never asked them to. Truckers gave him a nod with a little more gravity in their eyes. Veterans who came through the diner offered him a small salute, two fingers to the temple, subtle but meaningful. A local pastor even started bringing his confirmation class once a month, always ending the lesson with a quiet moment in front of the tribute wall Grace had helped build in the back of the cafe. "This place serves more than breakfast," the pastor would say. "Respect is served here, not just in the food, but in the spirit of those who serve something greater than themselves." Calvin never slowed down. He still poured coffee like it was sacred work, still knelt to fix a wobbly table leg with the same hands that once carried wounded Marines through dense jungle, still shook his head at overcooked bacon, still made sure the widow down the street got her eggs exactly the way her husband used to like them. But something had changed. There was a quiet transformation in the way people lingered, observed, absorbed. Calvin would glance up sometimes and see Grace at table 2, her notebook open, interviewing another veteran. Or he'd catch someone standing in front of the tribute wall longer than expected, their hand brushing the framed photograph or the worn pair of boots mounted beneath it. He'd notice the young man seated in the back booth, a soldier home on leave, eating in silence. But not alone. Not really. Not here. Calvin rarely spoke about any of it, but when he did smile, it meant something. It was the kind of smile that understood the fragile beauty of peace. Not the kind with confetti and parades, but the quiet kind. The kind found in small places, shared glances, and silent understanding. People gathered, remembered, healed. And in those ordinary, beautiful moments, Calvin knew this. This was what peace looked like. Every now and then, during the morning lull, he'd catch his reflection in the front window. Same old jacket, hair thinner and faded now, eyes a little grayer. But in those eyes lived a quiet contentment, the awareness that his life had been full. Not glamorous, not easy, but honest. Grounded. Right. One morning as Grace was refilling the napkin holder near the register, she looked at him and asked, "You ever think about putting those medals up out here?" Calvin looked up from the drawer of change, his face calm, and slowly shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Some men carry their medals on their chests. Others carry them in their silence." Grace didn't respond. She just nodded, heart full, because she finally understood. And so did everyone else. In a world that often shouts to be heard, Calvin Rohr had shown them something different, something better. That silence can be strong. That kindness can echo farther than noise ever could. That service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Sometimes it lives on in small routines, in dignity, in humility, in the way one man day after day kept showing up, not to be honored, but to serve something quietly noble. He didn't need a statue in the town square or a plaque with his name in bold letters. His tribute was far more humble, far more enduring. It lived in the way he treated strangers, with a warmth that asked for nothing in return. In how meticulously he wiped down a countertop, not because anyone was watching, but because he believed small things mattered. In the way he forgave, not loudly, not for show, but quietly, fully, like someone who had known real hurt and chose peace anyway. In how he remembered faces, stories, names that others forgot. He made people feel seen, not by declaring their worth, but by never questioning it. Calvin Rohr didn't need to be celebrated to be remembered. He had his corner booth at the diner, always open, always waiting. He had a wall filled with names and handwritten notes, each one a memory, a connection, a story shared over hot coffee and homemade pie. And more than anything, he had a town that would never forget him, not because he asked them to remember, but because he quietly, consistently earned it moment by moment, without a word. Every morning just before sunrise, He'd turn the key in the old door, hear the soft chime of the bell above, and watch the light stretch across the worn tile floor. In that still, sacred moment, he knew the truth. Respect is never demanded. It is lived, earned in the quiet ways, in the moments no one celebrates. In a world that seems to reward the loudest voice, where headlines scream and outrage gets applause, Calvin stood as something else entirely. A gentle reminder that silence isn't weakness, it can be strength in its purest form. Maybe it's time we remember men like him. Calvin never asked for a spotlight. He never once stood up to be seen. He didn't chase applause, and he never sought praise. He simply lived, with quiet dignity, with a servant's heart, with kindness that didn't need witnesses. He showed us that strength isn't always bold or flashy. Sometimes it looks like waking up before dawn to make coffee for a town that doesn't know all you've carried. Sometimes it looks like showing up every single day, even when you're tired, even when no one says thank you. That's the lesson he left behind, one that feels harder to hold on to in the world we're in today. Respect feels rare, patience thinner. We're quick to judge based on appearances. We raise our voices before we hear the full story. But Calvin's life was a whisper that echoed louder than any shout. He reminds us that the ones who give the most often speak the least, that the strongest souls often stand at the back, not the front. So maybe the next time we're standing behind someone who's taking too long at the counter, or we see someone who doesn't look the part of success, we pause. Just a moment. We breathe. We choose patience instead of pride, kindness over assumption, respect instead of reaction. Some medals shine on a chest. Others are carried quietly, hidden in the weight of silent service. Both deserve to be honored. Both matter. And maybe, just maybe, you've met someone like Calvin, someone who changed the way you see the world, not with speeches or grand gestures, but through a life lived simply and with purpose. Or perhaps you've misjudged someone before, too fast, too harshly, and only later realized how wrong you were. Let that reflection matter, because your story, just like Calvin's, could help someone else see more clearly. It could remind someone that real character doesn't shout, it serves. If this story stirred something in you, share it, like the video, subscribe, pass it on to someone who still believes quiet honor is the most powerful kind. Because heroes don't always wear uniforms or fly through the sky. Sometimes they wear aprons, or work boots, or carry scars you'll never see. Sometimes they're just the person pouring your morning coffee while carrying a lifetime of stories no one ever thought to ask about. Thanks for sitting with us for this one. Until next time, respect is always served.